December 21st, 1978, 11:47 p.m. Cook County Sheriff's investigators pushed through the front door of 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, Illinois, armed with a search warrant. They were looking for evidence connecting 36-year-old contractor John Wayne Gacy to the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast, who had vanished from a Des Plaines pharmacy 6 days earlier. Gacy had been under surveillance for days, following investigators openly, waving at them, buying them coffee, acting like this was all a tremendous misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. Detective Rafael Tovar walked through the ranch-style house, noting its ordinary suburban appearance: clean living room, kitchen with dishes in the sink, bedroom with a king-sized bed. Everything looked normal except for the smell. A thick organic odor permeated the house, strongest near the heating vents. Gacy had explained it away as moisture problems in the crawlspace, bad sewage pipes, dead rodents, but Tovar recognized the smell from homicide scenes. It was human decomposition. Lieutenant Joseph Kazenzak ordered officers to check the crawlspace beneath the house. Detective David Hochmeister removed the wooden panel covering the access point and dropped down into the shallow space beneath the floorboards. His flashlight beam swept across dirt and joists. Then he saw the lime. Patches of white powdered lime scattered across the dirt floor, concentrated in rectangular patterns. He began digging with his hands. 6 inches down, his fingers touched something soft and fibrous. He pulled back the dirt. It was fabric. Denim. He dug deeper. Beneath the denim was flesh, partially decomposed, recognizably human. He called up to the officers above. "We've got bodies down here." Over the next week, forensic teams excavated the crawlspace beneath John Wayne Gacy's house. They found 29 bodies, buried in carefully arranged rows, some stacked on top of each other, many in advanced stages of decomposition, some reduced to skeletal remains. The victims were teenage boys and young men, strangled, their bodies buried in shallow graves beneath the house where Gacy had lived for 6 years, where he'd hosted elaborate summer parties with hundreds of guests, where neighbors had come for drinks and political fundraisers, where his employees had worked daily, where his mother had visited for Sunday dinners. For 6 years, John Wayne Gacy had run a successful contracting business, served as a Democratic Party precinct captain, entertained as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals and charity events, and murdered at least 33 young men, burying most of them beneath his floorboards. The question wasn't just how he did it. The question was how nobody knew. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His father was a machinist and World War I veteran who drank heavily and beat his children regularly. Young John was overweight, unathletic, and frequently ill, suffering from a congenital heart condition that prevented him from playing sports. His father ridiculed him constantly, calling him a sissy and a failure, comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. Gacy spent his childhood desperately trying to win his father's approval and never succeeding. At age 9, Gacy was molested by a family friend, a contractor who took him for rides and sexually abused him in his truck. Gacy never told his parents, knowing his father would blame him. At age 11, he was struck in the head with a swing, suffering a blood clot in his brain that went undiagnosed for 5 years and caused blackouts throughout his adolescence. These head injuries, combined with his father's abuse, created a volatile psychological foundation. But they didn't create a serial killer. Millions of people experience childhood trauma without becoming murderers. Gacy's pathology developed from specific choices he made, specific lies he told himself, specific lines he crossed and then kept crossing. He dropped out of high school, but later earned his GED and attended business college. He was intelligent, personable when he wanted to be, skilled at reading people and telling them what they wanted to hear. In 1964, he married Marlynn Myers, whose father owned a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy moved to Iowa, managed the restaurant, became active in the Jaycees civic organization, threw himself into community service. He seemed to be building a normal life. He and Marlynn had 2 children. Neighbors and co-workers described him as ambitious, friendly, a bit overbearing, but fundamentally decent. They didn't know about the teenage boys. Gacy had begun sexually assaulting young male employees at the restaurant, plying them with alcohol, pornography, and persuasion. In 1968, he was arrested for orally sodomizing 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, son of a fellow Jaycees member. Gacy claimed the sex was consensual. Iowa had no concept of statutory rape applying to homosexual acts in 1968, so Gacy was charged with sodomy. He hired another teenager to beat up Voorhees to prevent him from testifying, but the assault failed and added a witness intimidation charge. On December 3, 1968, Gacy was convicted and sentenced to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. Marlynn divorced him while he was incarcerated. His father died during his imprisonment, never having reconciled with his son. Gacy later said his father's death without forgiveness was one of the defining traumas of his life. But he used his time in prison productively from a manipulative standpoint. He became a model prisoner, headed the prison Jaycees chapter, organized events, impressed the parole board with his apparent rehabilitation. He served only 18 months before being released on parole in June 1970. Legally, he was a registered sex offender. Psychologically, he had learned nothing except how to hide better. He moved back to Chicago, living briefly with his mother, before buying the house at 8,213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park in 1971. He started PDM Contractors, a small construction and remodeling company that quickly became successful. Gacy was an excellent salesman, a skilled contractor, and a tireless worker. He hired teenage boys, often runaways or kids from troubled homes, paying them in cash, offering them work when no one else would. To the community, he was a self-made success story, a divorced man rebuilding his life. In 1972, he married Carol Hoff, a divorcee with 2 daughters. They moved into the Somerdale house together. Carol would later testify that their sex life deteriorated almost immediately. Gacy showed little interest in intimacy with her, stayed out late on contracting jobs, came home smelling like chemicals. She found gay pornography magazines in the garage. When she confronted him, he claimed they belonged to an employee. She noticed strange smells in the house, asked about them repeatedly. Gacy explained them away with a rotating series of excuses: moisture in the crawlspace, sewer gas, dead animals. The garage sometimes smelled like rotting flesh. Gacy said it was from work materials. She believed him because she had no reason not to, because he was her husband, because the alternative was unthinkable. What Carol didn't know was that John Wayne Gacy had committed his first murder in January 1972, just months after buying the house. Timothy McCoy, 16, had arrived at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal from Michigan. Gacy picked him up, offered him a place to stay, brought him back to the Somerdale house. Gacy later claimed that McCoy came at him with a knife in the morning and that he killed him in self-defense, strangling him during a struggle. Whether that was true or a lie, Gacy told himself to justify the murder is unknowable. What is known is that after McCoy was dead, Gacy experienced an orgasm. The act of killing, of having total power over another human being, produced sexual release. The pattern was established. The compulsion was activated. But Gacy didn't kill again for 3 years. He maintained his contracting business, his marriage, his community involvement. He became a Democratic Party precinct captain, organizing fundraisers, meeting local politicians. He created Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown characters, performing at children's hospitals and parades. Photographs from this period show Gacy in full clown makeup, smiling broadly, surrounded by children. The juxtaposition of those images with what he was becoming is deeply disturbing. The clown persona wasn't a disguise for evil. It was another performance in a life built on performances, another role Gacy played to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that he was normal. In 1975, the killings resumed. John Butkovich, 18, one of Gacy's employees, disappeared in July after confronting Gacy about unpaid wages. Gacy strangled him and buried him in the garage beneath fresh concrete. Daryl Sampson, 19, vanished in April 1976. Randall Reffitt, 15, and Samuel Stapleton, 14, disappeared together in May 1976. Michael Bonin, 17, in June. William Carroll, 16, in June. James Hawkinson, 16, in August. Rick Johnston, 17, in August. The victims were young, often from troubled backgrounds, frequently runaways, or boys who wouldn't be immediately missed. Gacy targeted vulnerability with predatory precision. His method was consistent and methodical. He'd approach boys at the Greyhound station, at downtown Chicago cruising areas, at his contracting jobs. He'd offer work, money, alcohol, a place to stay. Once he had them at the Summerdale house, he'd engage them in conversation, show them his rope trick or handcuff trick, convincing them to let him demonstrate an escape technique. Once they were restrained, the performance ended. He'd rape them, torture them, strangle them slowly with a tourniquet device he'd constructed from rope and a hammer handle. He called it the rope trick. It allowed him to control the speed of death, to watch his victims' faces as they died, to experience the complete power he'd craved since childhood. After the murders, he'd keep the bodies in the house for hours, or sometimes days, often placing them in the bathtub. Then he'd drag them to the crawlspace access in his bedroom closet and bury them in the shallow space beneath the house. He'd pour lime over the bodies to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. He'd cover the graves with dirt and return to his regular life, running his business, attending Democratic Party meetings, performing as Pogo the Clown, sleeping in his bedroom directly above the burial ground. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this double existence suggests profound psychological compartmentalization, but not insanity. Gacy knew exactly what he was doing. He planned carefully. He selected victims strategically. He disposed of evidence methodically. Carroll divorced him in March 1976, citing his homosexual activities and his controlling behavior. After the divorce, with no wife in the house to potentially discover his crimes, Gacy's killing accelerated dramatically. In 1977 alone, he murdered at least 12 young men. The crawlspace beneath the house was filling up. Bodies were stacked on top of previous bodies. The lime couldn't mask the smell anymore. Employees working at the house complained about the odor. Gacy told them it was sewer gas. Neighbors noticed it during summer months when windows were open. Gacy explained it as moisture problems. No one investigated, because John Wayne Gacy was a respected member of the community, a successful businessman, a Democratic Party official, who had met First Lady Rosalind Carter and been photographed with her at a political event. He threw elaborate summer parties at the Summerdale house during this period. Hundreds of guests attended, neighbors, business associates, Democratic Party members, local politicians. They drank beer and ate barbecue in the backyard, standing above 20-some buried corpses in the crawlspace. They used the bathroom that Gacy used to wash bodies. They sat in the living room where Gacy strangled victims. The house had become his private killing ground, and no one knew because they weren't looking. Why would they look? Gacy was likable, successful, community-minded. The possibility that he was also a serial killer torturing and burying teenage boys beneath his floorboards was outside the realm of normal consideration. By late 1978, the crawlspace was completely full. Gacy had no more room to bury bodies, so he changed his disposal method. In the spring and summer of 1978, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River instead of burying them. 4 victims from this period were recovered from the river: Timothy O'Rourke, 20, Frank Landingen, 19, James Mazzara, 20, and Robert Gilroy, 18. Gacy would later claim he'd run out of burial space, as if this were a logistical problem rather than a moral catastrophe. On December 11, 1978, Gacy made his final mistake. Robert Piest, 15, was working at the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines when Gacy came in to discuss a potential remodeling job with the owner. Piest's mother was waiting outside to pick him up and take him to a birthday party for her. Piest told co-workers he'd be right back, that he was going to talk to a contractor about a summer job. He walked out to the parking lot to talk to Gacy. He never came back. Piest's mother reported him missing immediately. Des Plaines Police Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak investigated and quickly identified Gacy as the last person seen with the boy. When Kozenzak ran Gacy's background, he discovered the Iowa sodomy conviction, the pattern of hiring teenage boys, the suspicious circumstances. He obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house and vehicle. The December 13th search found homosexual pornography, police badges, handcuffs, a high school ring belonging to a missing boy, and multiple personal effects that didn't belong to Gacy. But they didn't find Robert Piest. Kozenzak put Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. Gacy responded by openly taunting the investigators following him, inviting them into restaurants, buying them coffee, acting as if this were all an amusing game that would end when they realized their mistake. Behind the jovial facade, he was panicking. He knew the investigation would eventually uncover the bodies. On December 21st, after learning that investigators had obtained a second, more comprehensive search warrant, Gacy confessed to his lawyers that there were bodies in his house. His lawyers contacted prosecutors. The search warrant was executed that night. When Detective Hotchmeister discovered the first body in the crawlspace, the investigation transformed into a recovery operation and homicide investigations of unprecedented scale. Over the next week, forensic teams worked in the freezing December cold, excavating the crawlspace, cataloging remains, attempting to identify victims. The crawlspace was only 3 feet high in most places, forcing investigators to work on their stomachs in the dirt alongside decomposing corpses. The smell was overwhelming. Many officers became physically ill. Some required counseling after the ordeal. 29 bodies were recovered from beneath the house, 26 in the crawlspace, 3 buried in the garage and yard. 4 additional bodies were recovered from the Des Plaines River, where Gacy had dumped them after the crawlspace filled. Robert Piest's body was pulled from the river near the Eba 55 bridge in April 1979, identified by dental records and clothing. The total confirmed victim count was 33, making John Wayne Gacy the most prolific serial killer in American history at that time. Identifying the victims was agonizing work. Many bodies were in advanced decomposition or skeletal. Some had been buried for over 6 years. Forensic anthropologists used dental records, medical records, and personal effects to identify victims. Eventually, 25 of the 33 victims were positively identified. 8 remain unidentified to this day, known only by the numbers assigned to them during recovery. Victim number 19, victim number 24, victim number 26. Young men who died beneath John Wayne Gacy's house, whose families may still be wondering what happened to them. The identified victims ranged in age from 14 to 21. Most were from the Chicago area. Many were runaways or boys from troubled homes. Some were Gacy's employees. Some were boys he picked up at the Greyhound station. Their names deserve to be remembered: Timothy McCoy, John Butkovich, Darrell Sampson, Randall Reffett, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll, James Hawkinson, Rick Johnston, Kenneth Parker, Michael Marino, William Bundy, Francis Wayne Alexander, Gregory Godzik, John Six, John Prestige, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy, John Mowery, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Mazzara, Robert Peast, and the 8 who remain nameless. Gacy confessed to the murders in detail, describing his methods, his victim selection, his disposal techniques, but he showed no genuine remorse. He blamed the victims, claiming they'd propositioned him, that he'd killed them in rage over being approached sexually by males. He portrayed himself as the victim of his own homosexual impulses, as if murdering 33 people were an understandable response to internal conflict about sexual orientation. Psychologists who evaluated him diagnosed antisocial personality disorder and noted his profound narcissism, but found him legally sane. He knew right from wrong. He simply didn't care. His trial began in February 1980 in Chicago. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the bodies, the personal effects, the recovery photographs, testimony from survivors who'd escaped Gacy's attacks, and Gacy's own detailed confessions. The defense argued insanity, claiming no sane person could commit such acts. The jury rejected the insanity defense. On March 13, 1980, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. Judge Louis Garippo sentenced him to death. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center. He gave interviews, painted clown paintings that sold to collectors, maintained correspondence with numerous people, and continued to lie about his crimes. He claimed he was innocent of some murders, that his employees had committed them, that he was being framed. He filed numerous appeals, all rejected. He never took genuine responsibility. He never expressed authentic remorse for the families destroyed by his actions. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. His last meal was fried chicken, French fries, strawberries, and Diet Coke. His last words were reportedly, "Kiss my ass." He was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m. He was 52 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate, holding signs and cheering when his death was announced. Victim family members attended, some finding closure, some feeling only emptiness. The Gacy case revealed catastrophic failures in missing persons investigations. Most of Gacy's victims had been reported missing by their families, but in the 1970s, police often dismissed missing teenage boys as runaways, particularly if they came from troubled homes or were suspected of being gay. Reports were filed, but not actively investigated. No one connected the pattern of disappearances. No one noticed that multiple missing boys had last been seen in the area where John Wayne Gacy operated his contracting business. The dismissive attitude toward missing gay youth allowed Gacy to kill for 6 years. The case also exposed how effectively a charismatic sociopath can manipulate public perception. Gacy was a pillar of his community. He received awards for his charitable work. He was photographed with politicians. He threw parties where hundreds of people never suspected what lay beneath their feet. His employees worked at the house daily and never investigated the smell thoroughly. His mother visited for Sunday dinners and never looked in the crawlspace. The cognitive dissonance between successful businessman and community leader and serial killer was too great for most people to bridge without concrete evidence. After Gacy's execution, the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was demolished. The lot remained vacant for years because no one wanted to build on ground where 33 people had been murdered. Eventually, a new house was constructed at the site with a different address. The Des Plaines River, where Gacy dumped 4 bodies, flows on, The Greyhound bus terminal where he hunted for victims is gone. The Democratic Party office where he worked as a precinct captain is closed. The physical locations associated with John Wayne Gacy's crimes have mostly disappeared, but the impact remains. Families of the 8 unidentified victims still search for answers. Organizations like the DNA Doe Project work to identify remains using modern forensic genealogy techniques. In 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart ordered DNA testing on the unidentified victims, hoping advancing technology might finally give them their names back. Some families whose sons disappeared in the 1970s and were never found have submitted DNA samples, hoping for closure, hoping to finally know what happened. The image of John Wayne Gacy as Pogo the Clown has become a cultural symbol of hidden evil, of the monster wearing a friendly face. But focusing on the clown obscures the real story. Gacy wasn't a supernatural entity or an incomprehensible aberration. He was a human being who chose, repeatedly, to abduct, torture, rape, and murder teenage boys to satisfy his need for power and control. He was enabled by systemic indifference to missing gay youth, by his own skill at manipulation, and by a society willing to overlook warning signs when the suspect seemed successful and respectable. The 29 bodies buried beneath his house weren't symbols or statistics. They were boys who had lives, families, futures. They were sons who never came home, brothers who disappeared, friends who were mourned. John Wayne Gacy took all of that from them because he wanted to, because he could, because he valued his sexual gratification and sense of power more than their right to exist. The parties he threw above those graves, the business he ran from that house, the community respect he cultivated, all of it was performance, all of it was manipulation, all of it was a lie. The neighbors who smelled nothing for 6 years weren't stupid or complicit. They were normal people who couldn't imagine that the smell coming from their neighbor's house was human decomposition, because why would they imagine that? The employees who complained about the odor and accepted Gacy's explanations weren't negligent. They had no reason to suspect their employer was a serial killer. The police officers who dismissed missing person reports weren't intentionally allowing murders. They were operating under assumptions about runaways that reflected societal biases against gay youth and troubled teenagers. Evil thrives in those gaps. It thrives in the space between what seems possible and what is actually happening. It thrives in the assumptions we make about respectable people, in the biases that determine whose disappearance matters, in the human tendency to accept explanations that preserve our sense of the world as fundamentally safe and comprehensible. John Wayne Gacy understood those gaps. He built his entire life in them, and 33 young men died because of it. The crawlspace beneath 8213 West Summerdale Avenue is empty now, filled with clean dirt, covered by a new foundation, topped with a different house. But the absence of those 33 young men echoes through the decades. They deserved better than John Wayne Gacy. They deserved better than a society that didn't prioritize finding them. They deserved to be remembered not as his victims, but as individuals whose lives had value, whose deaths should have been prevented, whose names, even the 8 still unknown, matter more than the name of the man who killed them.